In the morning, I rose early and drove the couple of miles along the coast to Red Bluff Beach, where I had been told I would find a cairn marking the spot where two naughty Dutchmen had been left to their lonely fate. It was a dramatic spot, a very large rock platform bashed by waves which threw spray everywhere. Leading off to one side was a long, duny beach marked at intervals with signs saying, "Caution, dangerous rips." The ocean was a bright turquoise, and the long beach was being pounded by a fury of big waves. I had a good hunt around the area, but couldn't find the cairn anywhere, and there was no one out at this hour to ask except for a couple way down the beach exercising a bouncy dog. It hardly mattered. Whoever built the cairn had have done so long after the fact and was almost certainly guessing. So I just enjoyed the sunshine and sea fresh air, realized with a touch of surprise that the idea of being stranded here wasn't entirely without appeal. It was a lovely spot. The sea was lavishly fruitful, and the hills behind abounded in materials for building. Loose and Pilgrim, again for mysterious reasons, were quite generously endowed by Pulsart. They were left with small boat, food and water, and a few tools and some trinkets with which to trade with the natives, if any could be found. There were certainly far worse places in the world to spend out your days, not least fetid and malarial dungeon in Batavia, which was their alternative fate. Assuming cordial relations with the natives, you could make quite a nice life for yourself here. I was quite taken with the notion, not least because it was so patently a real possibility here. The coastline of Western Australia north from Perth is astoundingly beautiful and almost entirely untouched by development. Beyond Kalbarri, there is not a single town for some 200 miles to Carnarvon, and just one side road to the sea. Just one side road to the sea, the one I was heading for at Shark Bay. Beyond Carnarvon, it's much the same for another 1800 miles to Darwin, just a coastline of undisturbed splendor dotted at distant intervals with small communities. Altogether, Western Australia has some 7,800 miles of coastline and only about 3 dozen coastal communities, even including those along the southwestern peninsula from which I had just come. That is, of course, why it took so long to discover the stromatolites at Shark Bay. Though they are there on the edge of an accessible shell beach for any fool to see, they weren't noticed by anyone until 1954 and not identified by science for another decade. But then, with almost 23,000 miles of Australian coastline to investigate, it takes time to get to it all. From Kalbarri, it was 40 miles back to the northwest coastal highway. There is still just the one road in and out, and then another 100 or so miles on to Shark Bay. In 2.5 hours, I passed just 3 other cars and a solitary barreling road train. At one point, I saw a couple of mysterious dots in the road far ahead. It turned out to be 2 workmen digging a hole in the middle of a highway and protected from either direction by a single orange plastic cone placed in the center of the road about 5 feet from where they worked. This was, you understand, the main West Coast Highway. It was an arresting reminder of just how far from anywhere I was. This was about as far from the main population centers as you can get in Australia. By road from where I was now, it was over 4,000 kilometers to Sydney and nearer 5,000 to Brisbane. Even Alice Springs, the nearest town to the east, was 4,000 highway kilometers away because of the way the roads ran. At length, in the middle of a featureless nowhere, I came to the turn-off for Shark Bay. I followed a newly paved side road for a few miles to another unpaved side road, which passed through a marshy landscape for another mile or so. It ended at an old telegraph repeater station at a place called Hamelin Pool, a complex of white wooden buildings, one of which now announced itself as a museum, another as a cafe and a gift shop. The parking lot had only 2 or 3 other cars in it, but as I stood reading an information board, 2 buses pulled up in convoy, whizzed to a pneumatic halt, and almost at once began disembarking streams of passengers, all white-haired, camera-toting, and blinking confusedly under the impossible glare of sun. They appeared to be from all over America, Britain, Holland, Scandinavia. Having come this far, I didn't wish to share the experience with 100 twittering strangers, and I set off in a brisk stroll for the beach along a chalky track. It was amazingly hot. A breeze was running in from the sea, but it seemed only to bring more heat. After about half a mile, the truck brought me to a sumptuously sunny bay, flat, calm, and of the deepest aquamarine. At some distance across the water, a long sandbar ran in a lazy curve out to sea. This, I gathered, was the Four-Sill, a 30-mile-long dune barrier that nearly encloses the bay and gives it its special character, namely warm, shallow, very saline waters of the sort that once prevailed across the planet when stromatolites were king. Nowhere in any direction was there a sign of human intrusion except directly ahead, where a nifty wooden walkway zigzagged for 150 feet or so out into the bay over some low, dark, primeval-looking masses that didn't quite break the water's calm surface. I had found my living stromatolite. Eagerly, I boarded the walkway and followed it out to the first cluster of shapes. The water was as transparent as glass and only 3 or 4 feet deep. Stromatolites were so primitive of nature that they don't even adopt regular shapes. They just sort of, as it were, blob out. Nearer the shore, they formed large, slightly undulant platforms, rather like very old, poorly laid asphalt. Farther out, they were arrayed as individual clumps that brought to mind very large cow pies, or perhaps the dung of a particularly troubled elephant. Most books refer to them as club-shaped or cauliflower-shaped or even columnar. In fact, they are shapeless gray blobs without character or luster. It has to be immediately conceded that a stromatolite formation is not a handsome or striking sight. I can guarantee that your reaction upon seeing a bed of living stromatolites for the first time will be to say, in a vague, ruminative, cautiously favorable tone you would use if you were given a canapé that tasted better than it looked, but not so good that you wanted another right away, or possibly ever. It is a sound that says, well, I'll be. So it's not the sight of stromatolites that makes them exciting. It's the idea of them, and in this respect, they are peerless. Well, imagine it. You are looking at living rocks, quietly functioning replicas of the very first organic structures ever to appear on Earth. You are experiencing the world as it was 3.5 billion years ago, more than 3/4 of the way back to the moment of terrestrial creation. Now, if that is not an exciting thought, I don't know what is. As the aforementioned paleontologist Richard Fortey has put it, this is truly time traveling, and if the world were attuned to its real wonders, this site would be as well known as the pyramids of Giza. Quite right. Stromatolites are rather like corals in that all of their life is on the surface, and that most of what you are looking at is the dead mass of earlier generations. If you peer, you can sometimes see tiny bubbles of oxygen rising in streams from the formations. This is the stromatolite's only trick, and it isn't much, but it is what made life as we know it possible. The bubbles are produced by primitive algae-like microorganisms called cyanobacteria, which live on the surface of a rock, about 3 billion of them to the square yard to save you counting. Each of them capturing a molecule of carbon dioxide and a tiny bit of energy from the sun, and combining them to fuel its unimaginably modest ambitions to exist, to live. The byproduct of this very simple process is the faintest puff of oxygen, but get enough stromatolites respiring away over a long enough period period, and you can change the world. For 2 billion years, this was all the life there was on Earth, but in that time, the stromatolites raised the oxygen level in the atmosphere to 20%, enough to allow the development of other, more complex life forms. Me, for instance, my gratitude was real. The chemical process involved in this makes the little cells very slightly sticky. Tiny motes of dust and other sediments cling to their surfaces, and these slowly bind and accrete into the rocks I was looking at now. The stromatolites thrive here not so much because the conditions are particularly amenable to them as because they are discouraging to other creatures. The reason that stromatolites don't exist elsewhere is that they would be either washed away by stronger tides or eaten. Here, nothing else can survive the bitter salt waters, so there is nothing to graze the stromatolites away. That stromatolites gave rise to life on Earth, then became a food themselves, and were eaten out of existence, has a certain irony, of course. Something not entirely unlike that happened to me now, for as I stood studying the crystalline waters, the elderly day trippers could be heard coming down the track, and a few minutes later the sprayer among them began to arrive on the boardwalk. A woman in a Miami Dolphins eyeshade took a position beside me, stared at the water for some moments, waved away a couple of flies, then regarded her husband and, in a voice that would have drowned the clang of a steelworks, said, "Are you telling me we just crossed a continent for this?" I was feeling charitably disposed, so I turned to her with an understanding smile, and with all the gentleness and tact I could muster, I endeavored to ease her into a position of appreciation for this marvel that lay at our feet. I saluted her perceptiveness in recognizing that stromatolites were not much to behold, but explained how their diligent, infinitesimal chemical twitchings over a span of unimaginable duration made the world the green and lovely place it is. I pointed out, too, that at only 2 other places on Earth have such living formations been found, one elsewhere in Australia, the other off a remote coral cay in the Bahamas, both much smaller and practically inaccessible, so that this was the only place in the world where visitors could with relative ease examine these singular creations in their full understated glory. So in fact I concluded, and here I offered my warmest, most ingratiating smile, this really was worth crossing a continent for. She listened with what I can only call an air of startled submissiveness, never taking her gaze from my face. Then she touched a hand to my forearm and said, "Did you know that you have the most terrible sunburn?"